Thomas Day is the managing partner of Invent 2026, a new nonprofit economic development agency leading a Midwest innovation corridor rooted in invention, technology transfer, and entrepreneurship. Tom was on the initial team that built The Bunker, now Bunker Labs, a business incubator for military veteran entrepreneurs. He has a BA from Penn State University, an MSJ from Northwestern, and an MPP from University of Chicago, where he was a research assistant at the Milken Institute. Tom served in the U.S. Army as a military journalist, deployed with the 101st Airborne during the invasion of Iraq and occupation of Mosul. He also was a candidate for Congress in 2016. Thanks so much for being here with us today, Tom.
Cassie, thank you so much for having me. And just for clarification, I didn't win that political race. Not even close, but I had a great time.
Great. And with that, Tom, I'll let you take it from here.
Well, thank you so much, Cassie, and thank you so much to everybody joining us. And I assume all or most of you are fellow Northwestern alumni. It's such a pleasure to be here. I did the Medill School of Journalism from 2007 to 2008, class 2008, and had a wonderful experience. I was a reporter for. Well, I still, in many ways, consider myself still a journalist, certainly a writer, but I was a reporter, freelancing a bit in Washington for a little while. After I was done with the Medill School, I was a bureau correspondent for McClatchy in Afghanistan, 2009 to 2010. And I also worked for a little while outside of Atlanta in Macon, Georgia. So after my brief career in journalism, as Cassie mentioned, I did a public policy degree at U Chicago, and was on the team that built The Bunker, which is of course led by my friend and also fellow Northwestern alumni Todd Connor. The Bunker, since I have left, has expanded to my knowledge, several dozen different cities: Washington, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, a few others. But they're obviously doing tremendous stuff for veteran entrepreneurs across the country. Invent 2026, I'll tell you a little bit about it. We are a nonprofit that supports startups rooted in the Midwest region, and in particular Chicago, to license technology, build out new inventions into product form, and support visibility among potential corporate acquirers and venture capitalists. As I'll discuss, we think there is a intersection between the lab in the Midwest region and communities of entrepreneurship that through Invent 2026, we want to facilitate more licensing and new product development. So let me talk a bit about jumping into matters, the status of Chicago's innovation economy. In front of you, I have a series of headlines from the local Chicago technology sites and news sources, of which there are 5 by my count. And to be blunt, there has been a rather credulous approach toward a narrative of momentum in Chicago's technology economy, as the headlines plainly demonstrate, a feeling of things are hot in Chicago, that we're in a leadership role in technology. And to be blunt, there is simply no evidence of this. There is one headline not mentioned in this slide that reads that Chicago is, quote, rolling in VC, in venture capital. There's simply no evidence of this. That is completely inaccurate. There is obviously a kind of a political objective, I think, on the part of various influencers in our city to present the narrative of momentum, of activity in Chicago in technology fields. But it is tough to justify this fundamental narrative with the facts. So let's first define what is tech. Is tech simply coding, zeros and ones, mobile applications, web platforms, innovating on the business model side of the house? We've done a lot of that in Chicago. Of course, this question is rhetorical. Of course, technology is more than simply a new app. It involves, especially looking toward the next 10 years, these fields here: advanced materials, biotechnology, nanotechnology, advanced chemistry. The things that will fundamentally drive technology and improving our way of life, we believe, will fall largely in these fields and in the life and physical sciences. We think that is, tremendously important as we think about building an innovation economy in Chicago, that we simply cannot define tech as a new app. These things really do have to involve what we think are three fundamental elements. Number one, significant IP, which largely would come from universities and applied research labs, of which we have several competitive institutions here in Chicago. I would argue that aside from the city of Boston, we have as robust a community of applied research as any city in America. So significant IP is number one. Number two, much higher capital requirements. We have any number of institutions in events in Chicago to support pitch competitions where entrepreneurs who are largely building a mobile application or something innovative in as far as business models, where they can compete for a low five-figure seed check, $20,000 or so. That's wonderful. That's great. We don't want to criticize those efforts, but as we look at the fields I have in front of you on this slide, let's recognize that many of these inventions have been built through, multi-million-dollar research projects that, this money is already sunk. I mean, it's already been spent. And we, that element of significant IP in building significant IPs into products will not be supported by a $20,000 seed check. That's quite obvious. That'll get you maybe a couple of weeks of work. So that's the second element, much higher capital requirements. Number three is we think we will need to have much longer product development cycles. In short, we're not going to see startups that are commercializing inventions in the fields I have in front of you, who are going to be able to build out and identify and serve customers with a finished product in a short amount of time. These things on the part of venture capitalists who invest in these and startups in these fields will have to assume, of course, a great deal of risk, but will also have to assume a great deal of patience, that these things may take several years. So, one second here. Just figuring out the system. We have a strategy in Chicago that we are executing right now. This graph demonstrates it rather clearly. This is data that was provided by NGKF through Cranes in an article, I think it was about 18 months ago, charting out the number and the square feet of co-working spaces in Chicago. I think you all know what I'm referring to, but the open floor, jazzy working spaces like WeWork, of course, like 1871 on the 12th floor of Merchandise Mart, but many, many more than that, that were built to catalyze entrepreneurship, to socialize entrepreneurship, to support technology. We in Chicago have obviously put a lot of chips down on this strategy to catalyze technology through physical spaces that by their presence will, as the strategy goes, enable entrepreneurs to collaborate with one another, to gain visibility among venture capitalists. I would defer to various technology leaders in Chicago to define how they would view this strategy, but this graph plainly demonstrates that there has been an effort to catalyze entrepreneurship through these physical offices, through these co-working spaces. And by the way, the number of incubators and accelerators in the city of Chicago and the surrounding area would largely follow this same trajectory. So has it worked? Well, this graph would suggest that this strategy has worked. We have seen an increase in the number of venture capital deals over the last 8 years. But by the way, this graph documents the number of venture capital deals. The amount of venture capital deployed in the city of Chicago would follow the same trajectory. What we should also appreciate is that same upward trajectory from 2010 is seen nationally. It is seen in cities that you don't typically associate with being techie, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Europe, and of course nationally. This increase in venture capital, both in the number of deals and the amount of capital deployed, what we have seen in Chicago is very much a product of what we see nationally. So let's take a step back here. Why is this important? Those co-working spaces, these incubators, what I would note is that many of them are 501c3s, or nonprofits. We are a nonprofit as well. They are as well. They have received, we would estimate, a minimum of about $200 million of public and philanthropic support. This again speaks to a strategy that the city has deployed. It has largely, I don't mean to criticize Chicago as far as the strategy goes, it certainly has been replicated in other cities. There have been other co-working spaces pop up in cities like Washington, D.C., 1776 is the name of their hotspot, and others. I would argue Chicago has kind of taken this strategy to an extreme, but it certainly is replicated in other cities. But it does serve the public interest to examine just exactly why these dollars are being deployed to these co-working spaces and incubators, and certainly do some cost-benefit analysis. And that's part of why I wanted to speak to you about, is to get your feedback on some of the data that we have put together to examine and find answers. I'm flip-flopping around here. I forgot I had the slide. This is the percentage of deals that have been executed nationwide or executed in Chicago relative to how many deals have been executed nationwide. This, I would argue, is the kind of final judgment on Chicago's competitiveness as a venture economy. Same 2%. We've going back to the earlier slide about the amount of co-working spaces and square feet and the number of incubators that we've built. Has it worked? This would demonstrate the answer is just no. We had a great year last year as far as venture capital deployed to Chicago relative to venture capital that has been deployed to Chicago in previous years. But that was a product of an increase in venture capital deployed nationally. We simply cannot justify an increase in venture activity in the city of Chicago as being a product of any kind of engineered effort in the city of Chicago to catalyze venture activity. It's simply just a product of what we have seen nationally. In this graph demonstrates that pretty clearly. So one might wonder, well, Chicago's never going to be the Bay Area. Chicago's never going to be Silicon Valley. Frankly, I agree with that. However, I would caution everyone to not simply wave the white flag and accept that Chicago is condemned to being a second-tier venture capital market. In this graph, looking at what has happened in the city of New York, it explains or pretty clearly demonstrates that an increase in venture capital and venture activity is absolutely possible. We have seen a rather sharp increase in venture capital activity or venture activity in the city of New York. Why we have seen this increase in activity in New York, I cannot answer. I would suggest there has been, or at least there is, an effort to catalyze more technology transfer, complementing efforts to engineer entrepreneurship and venture activity in New York. We are aware of at Roosevelt Island in New York, they're building a campus with, CUNY, Cornell, Columbia, and NYU. There may be one or two other local universities who are a part of that deal as well. But whatever they're doing in New York City, it is working rather well. And we, as we look back at this graph here, whatever they're doing, we're not doing, apparently. So let's call time out here. Everybody wants to be Silicon Valley. And we need to unpack a bit what Silicon Valley is and how it was built. Was it built with hot co-working spaces and celebrating a scene? No, no, it was built, Silicon Valley was built, in fact, it wasn't even called Silicon Valley at this point. It wasn't called Silicon Valley until the 70s. It was built with a wealth of federal money that was deployed after World War II. The gentleman's picture you see on your screen, Frederick Terman, was well, let me take a stop right here. If you would like a much more extensive history on Silicon Valley than I will be able to provide in the time I have been allotted for this presentation, I would encourage you to look up The Secret History of Silicon Valley by Steve Blank. He, over the course of a 90-minute presentation, it's easily accessible on YouTube, talks about Frederick Terman and how he was able to build Silicon Valley into what it is. So I preface what I'm about to say with that. I'll give you the abridged version. Frederick Terman came over from Harvard after the war. He had served the Department of Defense in building technologies to go fight the Axis powers at Harvard, and then he moved to Stanford. and with him, he took a bunch of federal contracts to go build radar and communication systems to go fight the Soviets, our new enemy at that point. And with that money, they built new inventions as an alternative to pursuing a PhD. He encouraged his students to spin off new companies. Two of those students, Hewlett and Packard, took his advice. Many others did as well. It is that point of intersection where applied research projects at Stanford's engineering school became new companies that we see the beginnings of the culture of entrepreneurship that obviously grew into what Silicon Valley is today. I'll give you another book recommendation. After this period of the immediate post-war years, there's a book called Troublemakers by Leslie Berlin. Leslie, great book. I read it over my honeymoon earlier this year. It examines the years. I see Cassie just popped that up. The years from 68 to 84, where you see the birth of the biotech built on a patent generated with Stanford and University of California researcher, the recombinant DNA patent that was licensed to 73 different startups once it was made available for licensing. You saw in that period the birth of companies like Atari, of Apple, of Fairchild Semiconductors. All of these companies that really took Silicon Valley, it was at that point that Silicon Valley was called Silicon Valley. All of these companies had several critical elements that were common to all of these. Number one, IP I mentioned. Number two was an ability to test concepts there, physically in front of you. So I'll give you the example of Atari. They took their gaming system to a bar in the Bay Area and sat there and observed the users using their first game. Pong was the name of the game. They were also able to manufacture these products in front of them without sending things offshore. They had small and medium-sized manufacturers in the Bay Area that they sent their specifications to and prototyped right there in person. And this is what we are trying to build with Invent 2026, my nonprofit. So let me talk a little bit more about my nonprofit, if I may. This is a picture of one of several roundtable discussions. I promise the participants in our roundtable discussions, we were able to bring together a more diverse set of opinions than may be reflected in that photo. That we in 2016, brought together, well, I'm talking to a Northwestern audience, the gentleman whose head, the back of his head you're looking at is Jay Walsh, the Vice President of Research at Northwestern. Matt Terrell is to your left. He is the Dean of Engineering at the Institute of Molecular Engineering at the University of Chicago. Jim Schultz is in the white shirt, the dark hair facing the camera. He was the director of Intersect Illinois, and Alan Matthew, a venture capitalist in Chicago. The right foot in the bottom right-hand side of the screen is Jeff Binder, who is the associate lab director at Argonne. He was at that point at the University of Illinois. And there are others not pictured that we were able to bring to the table as well. All these conversations were focused on how do we build in the city of Chicago what they built in the Bay Area over the course of the past 60, 70 years. Not on a co-working space, not on a scene, not on entrepreneurial juju. For some reason, I keep hearing that, juju, like as if it's a pixie dust that we spread around the city of Chicago. No, what I asked them to do is to participate in these roundtable conversations, to understand the applied research assets that we have in the region, to understand how we can bring more federal and defense money to Chicago and the Midwest region, and to license these technologies to startups in the city of Chicago to commercialize their research and build out new products in the local region, just as they did in the Bay Area. So we issued this white paper. One more point. We issued this white paper, which you can read on our website, event2026.com. It explores our region's clusters. In the city of Chicago and the Midwest region, we are very competitive in food and ag. Of course, we have always been a food and ag economy in the city of Chicago, dating back to the stockyards. And transportation, we're told 80% of the goods that travel by rail and by road, I'm sorry, 50% of the goods that travel by rail and by road in North America travel through the state of Illinois. Water, have 80% of the potable water in North America in the Great Lakes region. And energy, got a lot of new renewable energy designs and batteries coming out of Argonne National Laboratory. The challenge that we have in what we are not doing in the city of Chicago, and everybody I think recognized that on the panel, is licensing these technologies to startups and building them out. Why startups? Because corporates are not going to be building out these inventions themselves these days. I am not here to give you an anti-Wall Street rally. I can if you'd like, but let's just not for the purposes of time. But let's recognize that gone are the days that General Electric, Ford Motor Company, all of these companies are going to assume risk attendant to new product development. What they will do, and because the financial markets have placed such downward pressure on R&D budgets, is acquire a startup that is building this new product after they have proven the technology and proven the market. We wanted Invent 2026 to be the platform to do that. So here is a ranking of the utility patents that we have generated in Illinois relative to other states. As you can see, we do very well. California has, 4 times the number of patents because doing some back of the envelope math, they've pretty much, they have 62 million people. We have 12. So, they have about 5.5 more times more people in California. So naturally they have more patents that they are generating at their universities. I made a point earlier that I believe that Chicago has as much in the way of applied research assets as any city in America, save maybe Boston. I guess perhaps San Francisco as well. But, the notion that we simply do not have the assets to be the next Silicon Valley or whatever you want to call it, a competitive innovation economy is just not defensible when you look at the number of utility patents that we are generating. Here's another graph. This is what I'm calling Big Ten country, these 4 states. They have about the same number of people as the state of California between those 4 states. And as you can see, California has slightly more patents, but nothing measurably or significantly more than the Midwest region. What they are doing is, in California, is they're commercializing this research. Here is a pretty damning report that the Milken Institute issued in April of 2017. Let me put this as bluntly as I can. If Chicago wants to be an innovation economy where we can celebrate all our successes that we do so well with these technology sources I cited in the second slide, then we need to fix this. The best we can do is 18th. Illinois Tech, the Illinois Institute of Technology, and Argonne National Laboratory are not ranked among these the top 225 research institutions in America. They didn't even rank in terms of technology transfer. It should be no surprise that the cities that we associate with being competitive technology economies, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, even Pittsburgh, are all represented in the top 10. We're not even close. So what we do have, I mentioned, are a lot of applied research institutions. So why such a focus? This is data that was issued, about 2-3 weeks ago. I had a great conversation with the gentleman who put this all together at the Illinois Science and Technology Coalition. Encourage everybody to take a look. This is what I kind of associate as being the report card for Illinois, as far as not just technology transfer, but our entire venture and technology economy. As you can see, if you look at the top part of that slide, we have among a sample of 942 startups that have emerged the last 5 years from Illinois students and or faculty, 146, so about 15%, involve technology transfer. That's a term we use to describe licensing an IP that was generated in the case of this study at the universities. It can also be applied to other research institutions as well. So 15% of these 942 companies were actually commercializing the technology. What did investors feel about the entire set of companies emerging from Illinois universities? Clearly, outside investors are much more interested in deploying their money toward these 15% of Illinois university startups that involve tech transfer. 483 million, so about 55% of outside invested dollars went to these 146 tech transfer companies. So to give you some more context, 4 years ago, we had 121. This isn't examined on the slide I'm giving you. I'm just telling you from my notes here. 4 years ago, we had 121 technology transfer companies in this same study. Okay, so in 4 years, we went from 121 tech transfer companies to 146 tech transfer companies. So roughly about the same. Now, 4 years ago, investors had invested $114 million in 121 tech transfer companies. 4 years later, investors invested $483 million in roughly the same amount of technology transfer companies. So not only are investors screaming out loud, please give us more tech transfer companies, they are making their voices louder over the course of the last 4 years. 4 times the amount of dollars just in 4 years have gone toward tech transfer companies emerging from universities. If you just say you're an entrepreneur or aspiring entrepreneur at an Illinois university, deciding, should I build a new software platform that doesn't involve an element of technology transfer, or should I look for an invention that is available for licensing, and should I go commercialize that? Given that fork in the road, the Illinois Science and Technology Coalition data demonstrates that you are 20% more likely to receive outside capital, given this data here, and you are on average likely to receive $5 million more dollars. The average investment in a technology transfer company in this data is $6.5 million. For non-technology transfer companies, it's $1.5 million. So a last point on this slide. This is also not, or maybe it is. No, I guess not. So last point not mentioned on the slide. The number of non-tech transfer companies emerging from Illinois universities over the course of the past 5 years has tripled, even though the number of tech transfer companies emerging from universities has more or less remained flat. What does that speak to? Well, back to that slide, with the increasing number of co-working spaces and incubators that we observe in Chicago. That is very much something that we see at Illinois and national universities as well. There has been a lot of effort and capital deployed to universities to support students that want to go into entrepreneurial career paths. That's great. There's a new one going up at Illinois Tech, the Illinois Institute of Technology, the Kaplan Center. Of course, Northwestern has the garage. What we would simply suggest is that these efforts, given what I believe the goals are to not just support students pursue entrepreneurial career paths, but support students who are looking to have successful entrepreneurial career paths, must involve an element of technology transfer. And frankly, given the Illinois Institute of Science and Technology Coalition data that is in front of you, I don't see how that is at all debatable. But let me add one more point. For the universities, they are incentivized by federal law, it's called the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, to license their technology because they are eligible to receive royalties from the startup that licensed their technologies and goes, as the story goes out, builds a company and gets lots of money from this invention that they have licensed. Google wrote Stanford a check for upwards, I think, $330 million because that was an invention that was built at Stanford, the algorithm that went into Google. So almost done here. What can solve this? This is a path, a new model that we propose, that we're trying to build with Invent 2026, that we think more closely replicates what they built in Silicon Valley, that they have built in Boston, that they have built in markets like the Research Triangle in North Carolina and even in Toledo, Ohio. It looks like this: engaging research laboratories to support quick licensing. That word "quick" should be highlighted, encircled, and lots of stars around it. Folks, in the Bay Area, I don't mean to dumb it down here, but in the Bay Area, if you want to go license a technology, you more or less just sign here and off you go for 6 months. It's done over like a dinner, right? Here it takes 18 months. And that is undermining our competitiveness in technology to an extreme extent. We cannot, if we are going to be a competitive innovation economy in Chicago, be bogged down with this bureaucracy that we are right now. And that is, I have emphasized to lawmakers, I have emphasized to university laboratories and faculty that we have worked with, that needs to be fixed urgently. SBIR, it's a program I'm talking about in a minute. This is a federal program that provides non-dilutive money to startups to build out, and startups and small businesses to build out technologies of strategic interest to the 11 or 12 different federal agencies that fund the program. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Bringing in advisors that we have worked with. We have built a very strong board of advisors in Invent 2026 to provide guidance to entrepreneurs who are commercializing research and provide their, in several cases, decades of experience in product development to make sure these inventions are not just taking form and function, but doing so with customers identified. Supporting prototyping. As I'll discuss in a moment, we have lost a great deal of industry in the city of Chicago since 1980. With what new industries have we replaced steel that we have lost in Chicago and other legacy industries? We think we can allow for new products to take form and function by engaging small and medium-sized manufacturers in the city of Chicago to build out and prototype products. But if for the researcher, that would allow them to do so right in front of them instead of sending things offshore and seeing what comes back in the mail 3 weeks later. And engaging corporate acquirers. I mentioned, corporates are not going to be doing these things internally. They need to acquire technologies from startups once the market has been demonstrated. That is what we are trying to build with Invent 2026. This is the SBIR program I mentioned. STTR is another, it's a sub program inside of the SBIR program that deals specifically with university researchers and entrepreneurs. That's a much smaller pot of the $2.5 billion bucket that the SBIR program supports each year. Here are the federal agencies that support the program by law. Agencies that spend more than $100 million in research and development are required to give out 3.2% of these dollars in the form of SBIR grants for small businesses and startups to build out these inventions and put them back into the acquisitions cycle. Comes in two phases, 150K or to 250K for the first phase. This is just simply to demonstrate the science. And phase two is typically as much as $1 million to demonstrate the market. This program is top of mind in the Bay Area. It's top of mind in Boston. In the state of Illinois, we rank 13th, but really among the very bottom states with a major municipal market in gaining SBIR grants, speaking to our challenges in technology transfer. So with that in mind, my nonprofit, Invent 2026, has built a program with the support, with the partnership of the Women's Business Development Center. This is a program that we have received funding from the Small Business Administration to provide, working with 14 startups that are commercializing an invention. They include forensic photonics. They have a fingerprint technology from Berkeley National Laboratory in California that currently, just like in the show CSI, crime scenes, investigators will take fingerprint samples by dusting them off and sending them by USPS in the mail to a laboratory and getting an answer on who the suspect is 3 weeks later. This fingerprint technology as I understand it, it scans the signature with an ultraviolet light, collects some data points, sends it back to the FBI database, and you're able to get an instant identification on who the suspect is right then and there. Big advancement. But you see, I mean, and there's several other companies we've worked with that similarly are commercializing a technology that involves significant IP, that involves a much higher capital requirements, that involve much longer product development cycles, but ultimately will involve solving a national technology challenge. Very excited. Let me put in a plug for our event June 13. If you want to email me, my email is tom@invent2026.com. If you're interested in joining, we'll have it. I can't give you the details because we haven't figured out the spot yet. I'm actually I looked at my phone. Maybe the guy who's running this program was supposed to get back to me this week on where that might be, but expect it to be in Chicago. We will showcase the companies we've worked with under this program. Love to have you there. Wrapping things up here. Why does this all matter? What does having a competitive innovation economy have to do with job creation in Chicago? Why should folks outside the 12th floor Merchandise Mart care if we have a competitive innovation economy? I recognize that this community, Chicago's technology community, can be a bit insular, but this is why it matters. I will leave to the PhD candidates to identify what is causing what, but we can plainly see there is a correlation between the talent that we are able to consolidate in Chicago, the economic growth that we would observe, the job growth in peer cities, and venture activities, right? And you see we're on the bottom of all of these. Here's why it really matters. This is a picture of a bunch of workers that in 1980 had worked for Wisconsin Steel on the south side that were told they no longer worked at their plant. U.S. Steel closed after, Acme Steel closed after that. And where we once had 200,000 Chicagoans in steel manufacturing, now we have next to zero. It is in this time period when, after Wisconsin Steel, that a young, ambitious, recent Columbia University graduate came into Chicago to launch his career as a community organizer. That community organizer was Barack Obama. 38 years later, with what new industries have we replaced steel? I would offer, if we can build new batteries, new sensors, new advanced materials, by simply taking the $15 billion that is deployed to Illinois each and every year in R&D and simply building out new products, we can put our manufacturing economy back on track simply by prototyping and supporting early stage manufacturing of industries, new industries that we can build in Chicago just by transferring our research into startups to build new inventions here. That is why this matters. And with that, I will answer a few questions. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that. Tom, I'd love to start off questions with hearing a little bit more about this tech transfer conversation around how 15% of student startups or university startups are tech transfer.
I see Cassie trying to get on.
Can you hear me, Tom?
Cassie, if you want to shoot me a note, if there's nobody, if there are no questions, I'm happy to wrap things up. Oh, okay. Sorry. I apologize. Mike Gilroy had asked me a question, and I didn't see that. I'm sorry about that. Mike, I will answer your question. The question is, why does licensing take 18 months in Illinois? I wish I knew. To be candid, there might be some cultural issues. There are a lot of folks getting in the way. We have had to meet researchers in basement garages talking about how to get around folks and get their research into the market through a startup. That is frustrating. And that is, we think, very much undermining our economic competitiveness in Chicago and Illinois and the Midwest region. Let's be clear. There is a model that it has existed for a long time at our research labs where, to give you an example, GE might write Argonne a big check to do collaborative research. Okay, that's great. That's fine. But GE will not build that out in a new product. It has to be a startup. We've emphasized that as clearly as we can. It has to be a startup that builds these out, that brings things from a technology readiness level 1. The feds work on a 1 to 9 scale. Technology readiness level 1, not just to a 4 or 5, which is what GE might write a check to Argonne to do, but from a 1 to a 9. In TRL 9, technology readiness level 9 is a finished product. That model of getting a massive check from a corporate, I don't believe that it works to bring in the maximum amount of money to the lab, particularly when you factor in the incentives for royalties that have been accrued by startups that have licensed the technology that would be then due to the laboratory, giving the example of what happened at Stanford with Google. But perhaps there has been a lack of speed in recognizing this new paradigm where these laboratories are going to have to rely on startups to commercialize their work because the corporates just aren't going to support new product development anymore. I gather from conversations that there is at least a recognition from labs that in the region that there does need to be more rapid licensing of inventions to startups, but activity, nobody has really observed that right now. Cassie, you have asked, can you talk a little bit more about tech transfer startups from universities in Illinois? What are the other 85% of startups from universities from Illinois? So, I mean, they're mobile apps. They are, software platforms. They're I think some in professional services. That is what you will more than likely see at 1871, the co-working space in the 12th floor Merchandise Mart in Chicago. I think everyone's familiar. That's fine. I mean, I hope I'm not giving anyone the impression that we are against these efforts. But looking at the data that not just from the Illinois Science and Technology Coalition that I presented earlier, but other sources as well, your chances of success in developing a new app now in 2018, 11 years after the iPhone was introduced, is just not very good.
Mm-hmm.
the success rates, as the figures I have presented to you would show, of tech transfer startups would certainly lead one to believe that we should be focusing a hell of a lot more energy and capital on catalyzing entrepreneurship with that element of technology transfer. And we have spent a ton of money, several $100 million, toward the 85% of the startups that you mentioned. We have not spent very much money at all in public and philanthropic support on tech transfer startups, and that makes no sense. I hope that will be recognized very soon, because the evidence couldn't be any clearer.
Yeah, Tom, and that's really interesting. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you great.
Great.
I can see your image on the bottom there.
Oh yeah, I didn't pop my webcam up, but Tom, this has been super interesting hearing you talk more about building, this innovation economy in Chicago. And we're getting close to 1 o'clock. I definitely want to make sure that I give you a few minutes to share anything else you'd like to add before we close out and end for the day.
Well, you may have gathered that I have been critical of Chicago's innovation economy and folks leading Chicago's innovation economy. I say that as somebody who is, I'd like to think, a part of this community. I mean, whatever names that are popping into your head, I know them personally, and many of them I consider friends, and I hope they consider me a friend as well. I have stepped out and authored several opinion pieces. I had one in Cranes a few weeks ago that have presented this model of driving new venture activity, the development of technology, and ultimately driving economic growth through technology transfer as an alternative to the co-working spaces that we have invested so heavily in. The title of this presentation was Chicago's Potemkin Village. That sounds provocative. That was by design. We need to break groupthink. We, Chicago, are not a competitive innovation economy. We are not a first-tier venture economy. There is absolutely no evidence that we are. And until we can figure this out, I have kept that slide of the folks from Wisconsin Steel 38 years ago. Until we can figure it out, these folks are not going to find answers. And it is up to us, those who want to see Chicago succeed as an innovation economy, to solve this. Last point. First of all, Amazon is not coming to Chicago. We all know that. We are not even a competitive applicant. But there have been many who have seen Amazon's second headquarters as the solution. That is, no. The solution is going to become when we figure out how to build new products from research. And I know that because that is what we observed in the Bay Area. 60, 70 years. That's what we observe in Boston. That's what we can build here. That's what this is about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tom, thank you so much for spending this last hour with us and talking through some of your thoughts and nonprofits and your work. And thank you to everyone for joining us for today's presentation. You can find all of our upcoming and archived webinars at alumni.northwestern.edu/career webinars. Have a great rest of your day, and go Cats.
Go Cats.